February 12, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The dawn that broke over the war-torn landscape was a familiar one, a humid, oppressive precursor to another day of sweltering heat and sudden, violent tropical downpours. The morning sun, a searing, white-hot disk climbing above the jungle canopy, cast long, distorted shadows across the rough, hastily laid Marsden matting of the main runway. On the flight line, 24 dark, menacing shapes sat silent, their paint a deep, glossy sea blue that seemed to absorb the first light of day. Major William Bill Guise, the commanding officer of Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF 124, a man whose weary eyes had already seen too much of the brutal air war in the South Pacific, checked the battered watch on his wrist. 0600 hours. In 2 hours, these Vought F4U Corsairs, the very first squadron of their kind to be deployed to a combat zone, would fly their inaugural mission in the Pacific War. This would be no routine patrol, no mere training flight to familiarize themselves with the local airspace. It was to be a full-blown combat escort mission, a deep penetration of 230 miles into the heart of Japanese-controlled airspace, all the way to the island of Vella La Vella. What none of the young, nervous pilots, their faces a mixture of boyish excitement and quiet apprehension, could possibly know was that the arrival of this single squadron, these 24 unproven and notoriously difficult aircraft, was about to trigger the most devastating and one-sided fighter campaign of the entire Solomon Islands conflict. For over a year, since the very first days of the war, the Japanese had ruled these skies with an almost mythical and seemingly unshakable dominance. Their primary weapon, the Mitsubishi A6M0, had become a legend, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and professional respect by every Allied pilot who had faced it. It was untouchable, unbeatable, a master of the aerial arts. That legend, meticulously built upon the wreckage of hundreds of Allied aircraft and the lives of their pilots, was about to die a swift, brutal, and violent death. The Pacific War, from the fiery ruins of Pearl Harbor to the desperate, bloody battles for Henderson Field itself, had taught the American armed forces a single, fundamental, and unforgiving lesson. Control the air, and you control the battlefield. Lose control of the air, and you lose everything. Since the opening salvos of the war, the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated a clear and often overwhelming superiority in almost every metric of air combat. Their training was more rigorous, their tactics were more fluid and aggressive, and, most critically, their primary fighter aircraft was technologically superior. The Zero could outturn any American fighter in the sky, from the sluggish Brewster Buffalo to the more capable Grumman F4F Wildcat. It could climb faster, it could fly farther, and its cadre of veteran pilots had been blooded in the skies over China for years, perfecting their deadly craft against outmatched and inferior opposition. The Imperial Japanese Navy's elite air groups, stationed at the massive, sprawling fortress of Rabaul on the island of New Britain, represented the finest and most powerful concentration of naval aviation in the entire Pacific. This force, numbering at times over 700 aircraft, was crewed by pilots with hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of combat hours. These were the hardened veterans who had swept aside the British at Singapore, annihilated the Dutch in the East Indies, and delivered the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor. They were men like the legendary Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a man who would eventually claim over 60 victories. They were men like Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Devil of Rabaul, who would become Japan's ace of aces with over 80 credited kills before his own death. These men were not merely pilots. They were artists of aerial combat, and their canvas was the vast, empty sky over the Solomon Islands. The elite Tainan Air Group, the 251st Air Group, the 204th Air Group, these storied units contained the absolute cream of Japanese naval aviation. Pilots who had trained for years before the war in a brutal, highly selective program. They were men who understood their aircraft as a seamless extension of their own bodies, who could feel the subtle shifts in airflow over the wings, who could sense the moment an opponent was about to make a fatal mistake. Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, the brilliant young commander of the Tainan Air Group, had personally developed and refined the tactics that maximized the Zero's unparalleled advantages while minimizing its few, but critical, weaknesses. His pilots flew in loose, fluid formations that allowed for a high degree of individual initiative while still maintaining a strong sense of mutual support. They had perfected the art of the turning fight, the dogfight, using the Zero's exceptional maneuverability to get on an enemy's tail and stay there, relentlessly, until the kill was certain. The Vought F4U Corsair, sitting on Henderson Field's dusty coral surface, looked like a caged and angry predator from another world. Its most distinctive feature, the inverted gull wings, gave it an unmistakable and almost sinister silhouette, a profile that would soon come to haunt the nightmares of every Japanese pilot who saw it. It was a monster of a machine built around the most powerful engine available. Powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial beast that produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower, the Corsair could achieve speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, a figure that was, at the time, almost unbelievable for a carrier-based fighter. The massive 13-foot 4-inch Hamilton Standard propeller, one of the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter, required the distinctive bent wing, designed simply to provide adequate ground clearance during takeoff and landing. Its armament was equally brutal. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, each firing at a rate of 750 rounds per minute. The total ammunition load was a staggering 2,350 rounds, with 400 rounds for each of the inner guns and 375 for the outer pairs. It was enough firepower to literally saw a fragile Japanese Zero in half with a single 2-second burst. But the raw specifications, as impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The Corsair was, by all accounts, a notoriously difficult and dangerous aircraft to fly. In fact, it had initially been considered far too dangerous for the unforgiving environment of carrier operations. Its incredibly long nose, a consequence of the massive engine, completely blocked the pilot's forward visibility during the critical final moments of a landing approach. Its stall characteristics were vicious. The left wing had a tendency to stall before the right at low speeds, causing the aircraft to enter a violent, often unrecoverable, snap roll. And its main landing gear's oleo struts had a tendency to bounce viciously on carrier decks, launching the aircraft back into the air at the worst possible moment, often leading to it careening into the ship's island or over the side. The U.S. Navy, after a series of harrowing and fatal carrier trials, had initially rejected it for carrier duty, declaring it an accident waiting to happen and relegating it to land-based Marine Corps squadrons. Yet these very same characteristics that made the Corsair so dangerous to its own pilots would also make it absolutely lethal in combat. The same immense power that made it so difficult to control on the ground gave it an unmatched rate of acceleration and an almost vertical climb rate in the air. The incredibly robust construction that added so much weight also meant that it could absorb a phenomenal amount of punishment, damage that would have instantly destroyed lighter, more fragile fighters. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 was a man who understood machinery. He had logged only 25 precious hours in the Corsair before his squadron was shipped out to Guadalcanal. A former enlisted man who had earned his coveted wings through sheer, gritty determination rather than through the traditional Annapolis pedigree, Walsh was a natural pilot. Born in Brooklyn and raised in the tough neighborhoods of Jersey City. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1933 at the age of 17, primarily to escape the poverty of the Great Depression. He had worked for years as a skilled aircraft mechanic before being accepted into the flight training program, a background that gave him an intimate, almost intuitive understanding of what made aircraft work and, more importantly, what made them fail. To him, the Corsair wasn't just an airplane. It was, as he would later describe it, 14,000 pounds of controlled violence. He knew that if you could master its ferocious temperament, if you could tame the beast, you would hold death's own scythe in your hands. The pilots of VMF 124 were a representative cross-section of American society, a far cry from the aristocratic, almost feudal officer class of the Japanese military. They were farm boys from Iowa who had never even seen the ocean before they joined the Marines. They were recent college graduates from across the nation who had given up comfortable, predictable futures for a chance to earn a pair of golden wings. They were former mechanics, store clerks, and construction workers who had discovered an innate and surprising aptitude for flying. What they all shared was their youth. Most were in their early 20s, and their almost complete and total lack of combat experience. They had trained hard for months at Camp Kearney in San Diego, practicing their gunnery, their formation flying, and their tactics. But they all knew that training, no matter how realistic, could not fully replicate the terrifying, heart-pounding reality of actual combat, especially combat against seasoned, veteran enemies who had been killing Americans with a cold, professional efficiency since the very first moments of the war at Pearl Harbor. Across the Solomon Sea, at the massive Japanese fortress of Rabaul, the daily routine of air operations was already underway. The sprawling base complex was a marvel of military engineering, encompassing 5 major airfields: Vianakanal, Lakanai, Rapopo, Tobara, and Karavat. The deep, sheltered waters of Simpson Harbor provided a secure anchorage for the cruisers and destroyers of the combined fleet. The town itself housed thousands of support personnel, a vast army of mechanics, armorers, communication specialists, and medical staff. It was, in effect, the Gibraltar of the South Pacific, a seemingly impregnable bastion, protected by a formidable ring of hundreds of the world's best fighter aircraft and a dense network of anti-aircraft guns. In the operations room of the 204th Air Group, Lieutenant Takashi Miyano reviewed the morning reconnaissance reports. The latest intelligence on American strength at Guadalcanal was, as usual, somewhat vague but not alarming. It was estimated that the Americans had between 40 and 50 operational fighters at Henderson Field, a mixed bag of types, mostly the obsolete P-40s and the stubby, underperforming F4F Wildcats. It was nothing, he concluded, that his Zeros couldn't handle. The 204th had recently arrived at Rabaul to replace the heavy losses suffered by the legendary Tainan Air Group, which had since been redesignated as the 251st. Many of the 204th's pilots were themselves hardened veterans of the China campaign, men who had honed their deadly skills against Chinese and Soviet pilots. They generally viewed the Americans as inferior opponents, lacking the spiritual discipline, the almost mystical connection to their aircraft, and the selfless dedication of true Japanese warriors. But the morning's reconnaissance photos, when they were developed and analyzed, showed something new and unusual on the flight lines at Henderson Field. There were 24 aircraft with distinctive, bent wings. They were clearly larger than the Wildcats, with a much longer nose than the P-40s. The Japanese naval intelligence had no official designation for them. The consensus in the ready room was that it was probably just another failed American design, rushed into service out of desperation. The Americans, they believed, were always trying to compensate for their inferior pilot skills with heavier armament and more armor. It hadn't worked with the Brewster Buffalo. It hadn't worked with the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Why, they reasoned, should this new and strange-looking aircraft be any different? VMF 124's first combat mission, the mission that would forever alter the balance of air power in the Pacific, began at precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of February 12, 1943. The roar of 12 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines shattered the morning stillness of Guadalcanal. One by one, the dark blue Corsairs thundered down the Marsden Matting runway, their massive propellers churning the coral dust into a thick, swirling cloud. They were tasked with escorting a single, slow, and vulnerable PBY Catalina rescue mission to Sandfly Bay near the island of Vella La Vella. The mission profile was, on its face, deceptively straightforward: provide high-altitude top cover while the lumbering flying boat attempted to retrieve 2 downed friendly pilots from water. Intelligence had predicted no significant enemy contact. It was intended to be a milk run, a gentle introduction to combat for the new and untested squadron. The Corsairs climbed steadily, their powerful engines performing flawlessly in the cool, clear morning air. Below them, the PBUI Catalina, a ponderous and unmaneuverable aircraft, lumbered along at a painfully slow 2,000 feet, a seemingly easy and tempting target for any prowling enemy fighters. Major Guys led the formation, his head on a constant, swiveling scan of the vast, empty sky, his eyes searching for the tiny, telltale specks of approaching enemy aircraft. The Japanese, he knew, had a terrifying and well-earned reputation for appearing as if from nowhere, their fighters often diving unseen out of the blinding glare of the sun. He had drilled his young pilots relentlessly, day after day, on the fundamental tenets of survival. Maintain your formation integrity at all times, he had repeated until he was hoarse. Watch your wingman's tail, and he will watch yours. And never, ever try to turn with a zero. Use the Corsair's advantages, its speed, its firepower, and its incredible ability to absorb punishment. Hit and run, dive and climb, but never, ever get into a slow-speed turning fight with a zero at low altitude. That is a fight you will lose. 20 minutes into the flight, as they neared their objective, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying on the wing of his section leader, spotted a subtle, almost imperceptible movement far below. It was a flight of 9 Zeros, climbing steadily from the southeast, positioning themselves for a classic high-side attack on the lumbering Catalina. They had almost certainly taken off from the Japanese forward airstrips at Bin or Baleo on Bougainville, forward operating bases that the Japanese used to extend the range and coverage of their fighter patrols. Walsh's voice, calm but charged with adrenaline, crackled over the squadron's radio frequency. Bandits, 8 o'clock low, climbing. The moment of truth, the moment they had all trained for and dreamed of with a mixture of excitement and dread, had arrived. 12 American rookies, flying a brand new and notoriously difficult fighter, were about to engage 9 seasoned Japanese veterans flying what was, until that moment, considered the most successful and deadly fighter aircraft of the entire war. Walsh, acting on pure, aggressive instinct, immediately rolled his Corsair inverted and pulled through in a classic split-S maneuver, diving from his perch at 18,000 feet. The Corsair, its massive engine screaming, accelerated with a ferocity that was unlike anything he had ever flown. The airspeed indicator, a needle on a dial that he had watched so intently during training, swept past 350, then 400, then an incredible 425 miles per hour. The control stick stiffened in his hands under the immense aerodynamic pressure, but the aircraft remained completely and reassuringly responsive. At this incredible speed, he knew the lightweight Zeros could not possibly follow him, even if they tried. Their wings, built for agility and not for brute strength, would simply fail under the immense stress, torn clean from the fuselage by aerodynamic forces that their designers had never anticipated. He lined up his sights on the trailing enemy fighter, a single Zero silhouetted against the blue of the sea. He waited with a patience that belied the incredible speed of the closure, waited until the wingspan of the Zero completely filled his illuminated gun sight, and then he squeezed the trigger. 6 streams of armor-piercing and incendiary .50 caliber rounds, a torrent of almost 80 rounds per second, converged at a single point 900 feet in front of his aircraft. The API ammunition was devastatingly effective against the Zero's notoriously unprotected and unsealed fuel tanks. The Japanese fighter did not explode. It did not catch fire. It simply and utterly disintegrated. It came apart in the air as if it had been smashed by an invisible, celestial hammer. The wings separated cleanly from the fuselage, the engine tore free from its mounts, and the shattered remnants tumbled into the sea. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Walsh pulled up hard, the immense G-forces crushing him down into his seat, and executed a perfect chandelle, a climbing turn that converted his immense speed back into precious altitude. 1 pass, 1 kill. The other Corsairs of VMF 124, seeing Walsh's success, followed his example, diving and climbing in a series of coordinated, high-speed boom-and-zoom attacks, using their superior speed and energy to slash through the now disorganized and completely surprised Japanese formation. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. When the surviving Zeros finally broke contact and fled, 3 of their number were falling toward the sea in pieces. Not a single Corsair was lost. In fact, not a single Corsair had even been hit by enemy fire. The fundamental tactical equation of the air war in the Pacific had, in those few brutal moments, shifted dramatically and permanently. The hunters had, with a shocking and undeniable finality, become the hunted. The remaining Japanese fighters, their pilots likely from the 582nd Air Group, which had recently arrived at Rabaul, retreated north at their maximum possible speed. They had just witnessed something that challenged and overturned everything they'd been taught, everything they believed about the nature of air combat. That evening, in the debriefing rooms at Rabaul, the atmosphere was somber and filled with a sense of profound shock. The surviving pilots, their voices a mixture of anger and disbelief, reported encountering a new and terrifying American fighter, an aircraft that possessed an almost impossible combination of speed and firepower. Their official after-action report, when it was finally filed, was detailed and deeply troubling. Encountered new American fighter type over Vela La Vela, it read. Possesses superior speed and dive characteristics. Carries exceptional firepower. Cannot be engaged in traditional turning combat. Armor protection appears to negate the effectiveness of our 7.7mm armament. Request immediate intelligence on aircraft identification and performance parameters. This simple, bureaucratic report was the first official Japanese acknowledgement that something fundamental, something deeply and existentially threatening, had changed in the air war over the Solomon Islands. Within a week, the Japanese pilots, with a grim and fatalistic sense of humor, had given the new American fighter a name, Whistling Death. The designation came from the distinctive, almost supernatural sound that the Corsair made in a high-speed dive, a banshee-like wail created by the air rushing through the oil cooler intakes located in the leading edges of its inverted gull wings. It was a sound that would soon come to precede devastation, a terrifying war cry that announced an execution from above. The Japanese ground troops on the embattled islands of the Solomons also learned to fear that sound with a primal terror. When they heard that high-pitched, mournful whistle, they knew that death was just seconds away. The impact of the Corsair's arrival was immediate and profound. Japanese bomber missions to Guadalcanal, which had previously been escorted by a dozen or so fighters, now required massive escort packages of 20, 30, or even more. And even then, their losses were consistently heavy. The Corsair's decisive speed advantage meant that its pilots could choose, with an almost complete freedom, when and how to engage. The Japanese pilots found themselves constantly on the defensive, their formations broken and scattered, trying desperately to protect their slow, vulnerable bombers while being systematically picked apart by a series of slashing, high-speed attacks that they simply could not counter. By March of 1943, all 8 of the Marine fighter squadrons stationed in the Solomon Islands were in the process of converting to the new Corsairs. VMF 121, VMF 122, VMF 123, VMF 213, VMF 214, VMF 215, VMF 221, and VMF 222. Each squadron, in turn, received its full complement of the formidable bent-wing birds. This rapid and widespread transition, however, was not without its own costs. A total of 7 Corsairs were lost to operational, non-combat accidents in the first month alone, tragic victims of the Corsair's notoriously unforgiving low-speed flight characteristics. Landing accidents, in particular, were tragically common. The Corsair's incredibly long nose meant that the pilots were essentially flying blind during the final, critical moments of their landing approach, unable to see the runway directly in front of them. They had to be taught a new and counterintuitive technique, a continuous, curving approach that kept the landing signal officer in sight until the very last moment, at which point they would kick the rudder to straighten the aircraft just before touchdown. If they got it wrong, the immense torque from the huge, spinning propeller would instantly and violently flip the aircraft onto its back. But those pilots who survived this steep and dangerous learning curve, those who were able to master the ferocious temperament of the bent-wing bird, found themselves in possession of a weapon that could utterly dominate any opponent it faced. The Corsair changed everything about the nature of air combat in the Pacific. The tactical revolution it sparked was immediate and decisive. The American pilots, now confident in their new mounts, completely and joyfully abandoned the defensive, turning dogfights that had for so long favored the Agile Zero. Instead, they universally adopted the aggressive, high-energy boom and zoom tactics for which their aircraft was so perfectly suited. The Corsair could dive at speeds that would literally tear a Zero's wings off. It could absorb an incredible amount of punishment, damage that would have instantly destroyed the lighter, more fragile Japanese fighters. And most importantly, it could catch and kill any Japanese aircraft from a position of absolute advantage. The Japanese, in their desperation, tried to adapt. New and often suicidal tactics were developed at the training bases back in Japan. They attempted to orchestrate coordinated attacks from multiple angles. They tried to set elaborate traps to force the Corsairs down into low-speed turning fights, and they began to target the aircraft's few known vulnerable spots: the oil cooler intakes in the wings, and the cockpit canopy rails where the armor was thinnest. But for every Japanese adaptation, there was an American counter. When the Japanese pilots learned to attack the Corsairs from directly astern to avoid their formidable forward-firing guns, the Corsair pilots simply adopted the thatch weave, a brilliant defensive maneuver where two friendly fighters would weave back and forth, each one covering the other's vulnerable tail. And when the Zeros tried to exploit their superior rate of climb at very low speeds, the Corsair pilots simply refused to engage below a self-imposed floor of 250 miles per hour, using their superior engine power to maintain their energy and their advantage. On April 1st, 1943, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, now a seasoned combat leader, led a division of 4 Corsairs on a fighter sweep over the Russell Islands. The morning was clear, with scattered clouds at 10,000 feet providing perfect concealment. A force of 30 Zeros rose to intercept them, climbing like angry hornets from the Japanese airfield at Munda. In previous encounters, such overwhelming odds would have meant certain death for the American pilots. But Walsh, who had spent every waking moment studying the Corsairs' capabilities and developing new tactics to exploit them, was confident. Instead of engaging in a general, chaotic melee, the 4 Corsairs maintained their altitude advantage, made a series of perfectly coordinated diving attacks, and then covered each other's climbing recovery. The battle quickly developed into a purely vertical fight, with the Corsairs diving from 20,000 feet, firing, and then zoom climbing back into the safety of the high altitudes. The Zeros, attempting to follow them to climb, soon found themselves hanging on their props, their aircraft on the verge of stalling, their airspeed bleeding away. At that precise moment of vulnerability, they were sitting ducks with the next Corsair in the diving, deadly rotation. Walsh himself personally destroyed 3 Zeros in just 7 minutes, each kill following the same methodical pattern: dive, fire, climb, reposition. His wingman, Lieutenant Archie Donahue, shot down 2 more. In total, the 4 Corsairs claimed 11 confirmed victories without a single loss to themselves. When they landed back at Henderson Field, the ground crews counted only 6 bullet holes among all 4 of the aircraft. The Zero's rifle-caliber 7.7mm machine guns were completely incapable of penetrating the Corsair's armor, and their 20mm cannons, while deadly against lighter aircraft, required sustained hits to do any serious damage to the robust American fighter. But getting those hits meant surviving long enough to aim. And against the Corsair's incredible speed and overwhelming firepower, that survival was becoming increasingly and vanishingly unlikely. The Corsair's incredible resilience was not a matter of luck. It was a deliberate and core component of its design philosophy. The armor plate installed behind the pilot's seat was thick enough to stop a high-velocity 20 millimeters cannon round. The windscreen was a heavy, multi-layered sandwich of bulletproof glass that could deflect anything short of a direct, perpendicular hit from a cannon. And the innovative self-sealing fuel tanks, which could absorb dozens of bullet holes without catching fire, completely negated the Japanese pilots' primary tactic of aiming for the wing roots to ignite their opponents. The Japanese response to this new reality revealed a growing and almost palpable sense of desperation. Intelligence reports, gathered from the invaluable coast watchers and from radio intercepts, indicated that the most experienced and valuable Japanese pilots were being systematically withdrawn from the slaughterhouse of Rabaul and sent back to the home islands to serve as instructors for the next generation of pilots. But training took time, a commodity that Japan no longer had, and the losses in the Solomons were mounting at a rate that was far faster than any training program could possibly hope to replace. The Japanese Navy's carefully cultivated pre-war cadre of expert pilots, men who had represented years of intensive training and priceless combat experience, was being systematically and irreversibly bled white in the skies over the Solomon Islands. By May 13, 1943, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh had achieved a significant milestone, a feat that no other American pilot had yet accomplished. He became the very first Corsair ace, with 5 confirmed aerial victories. His 5th kill, a testament to both his skill and his aircraft's superiority, came during a wild, swirling melee over the Russell Islands, when Walsh found himself completely alone and surrounded by 3 Zeros. Instead of running, the sensible and doctrinally correct option, he attacked. Using the Corsair's superior speed and energy retention, he made 3 separate, high-speed passes, shooting down 1 Zero on each pass. The last Japanese pilot, who was clearly a veteran given his aggressive and skillful maneuvering, attempted to lure Walsh down into a low-speed turning fight at 5,000 feet. The one arena where the Zero still held an advantage. Walsh, however, refused to take the bait. He responded by going completely vertical, pulling the Corsair's nose straight up and climbing until the pursuing Zero, its engine gasping, stalled and fell away. Walsh then coolly rolled over the top and dove back down, catching the Zero as it tried to recover from the stall. A long, devastating burst from his 6.50s tore the enemy fighter in half. 2 weeks later, Walsh's personal score stood at 10. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. In just 3 short months, a pilot with minimal combat experience, flying a fighter that the Navy had initially rejected, had become one of America's leading aces. The machine had, in a very real sense, made the man, and the man, in turn, had completely mastered the machine. But Walsh was not alone. Dozens of other young Marine pilots were now discovering what the Corsair was capable of, and a new generation of American aces was being born in the crucible of the Solomons. Their names, once unknown, would soon become legendary in the annals of air combat. Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen of VMF 215 would eventually score a staggering 25 victories in just 6 brutal months of combat, making him the highest-scoring Corsair ace of the war. His technique was deceptively simple but incredibly effective. Get high above the enemy, dive at maximum possible speed, hold his fire until he was at close, can't-miss range, and then climb away before the other Japanese pilots even knew what had hit them. On January 14, 1944, he shot down 5 Japanese fighters in a single mission, methodically and coldly picking them off one by one as they tried in vain to protect a bomber formation. However, the real, strategic shock for the Japanese pilots came not from the skill of individual American aces, but from the collective and overwhelming effectiveness of the Corsair squadrons as a whole. The aircraft's incredible range, over 1,000 miles with external drop tanks, meant that it could now escort the B-24 and B-25 bombers all the way to the Japanese fortress of Rabaul and back. Previously, the Japanese fighters had only to wait until the shorter-legged American escorts, the P-40s and P-39s, were forced to turn back due to low fuel. They could then savage the unprotected bomber formations at their leisure. Now, the Corsairs stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back, turning what had once been milk runs for the Japanese interceptors into deadly, unavoidable gauntlets of fire. On June 16, 1943, a massive force of over 100 Japanese aircraft was launched from Rabaul to attack American shipping at Guadalcanal. They were met by a force of 32 Corsairs from 4 different Marine squadrons. The massive, swirling air battle that followed was a perfect and brutal demonstration of the complete reversal of air superiority in the Pacific. The Japanese formation included the new Model 32 Zeros, which had a reduced wingspan for a better roll rate, and the Model 22, with improved armament. It made no difference. A staggering 77 of the Japanese aircraft were destroyed for the loss of only 6 Corsairs, a devastating 13-to-1 kill ratio that would be repeated with grim regularity again and again. Lieutenant Commander Toru Tanamizu, a veteran Japanese ace with over 30 victories, survived the encounter and, in his after-action report, wrote with a sense of utter despair. The new American fighters do not fight as we do. They strike from above like hawks, they fire their terrible guns, and they climb away before we can possibly react. Our Zero is no longer superior. We are being slaughtered by an enemy we cannot catch and cannot escape. His chilling report reached the desk of Admiral Yamamoto just weeks before the Admiral's own fatal encounter with American P-38s, another stark example of American fighters using their superior speed and firepower to systematically dismantle Japanese air power. The Corsair's psychological impact soon began to exceed even its formidable tactical success. Japanese pilots, men who had never known defeat, began to experience a new and unfamiliar emotion: fear. The distinctive, high-pitched whistle of a diving Corsair became a sound that triggered a primitive, gut-wrenching terror. The ground crews at the forward Japanese bases reported that pilots were beginning to refuse missions when the presence of Corsairs in the target area was confirmed. Some veteran pilots developed mysterious illnesses, combat fatigue, a concept the Japanese military refused to acknowledge, that kept them grounded whenever Corsair-escorted raids were expected. The carefully cultivated mystique of Japanese air superiority, the very foundation of their early war successes, was evaporating in the searing heat of the Corsair's gun barrels. The summer of 1943 saw the Corsair's role expand even further beyond that of a pure air-to-air fighter. The resourceful Marine pilots, always looking for new ways to take the fight to the enemy, discovered that their rugged aircraft could easily carry bombs. First, it was a single 500-pounder, and then a massive 1,000-pound bomb on the centerline rack. The Corsair, in a matter of weeks, became a true fighter bomber, a multi-role weapon system that was capable of fighting its way to a target, delivering its ordnance with the accuracy of a dedicated dive bomber, and then fighting its way home. The Japanese ground positions, which had previously been relatively immune to the light strafing of fighter aircraft, now faced devastating and incredibly accurate attacks from Corsair-delivered bombs. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, under the command of the charismatic and controversial Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, came to exemplify the Corsair's complete transformation of air combat. Boyington, who was already an ace from his time as a volunteer with the Flying Tigers in China, understood both the Zero and the Corsair as well as any man alive. His tactical innovations were designed to maximize the Corsair's unique advantages while completely negating the Zero's remaining strengths. The Black Sheep were, in fact, a collection of replacement pilots, misfits, and troublemakers who hadn't fit in with other, more conventional squadrons. But Boyington, a hard-drinking, brawling, and brilliant leader, welded them into the single most effective and feared fighter squadron in the entire Solomon Islands campaign. In just 84 brutal days of combat, VMF 214 destroyed a staggering 97 Japanese aircraft in the air, while losing only 12 of their own Corsairs, an incredible 8-to-1 kill ratio that would have been the stuff of pure fantasy just a few months earlier. They also sank or destroyed 21 Japanese vessels, from small supply barges to destroyers, and obliterated numerous ground installations. On September 16, 1943, Boyington led a sweep of 24 Corsairs over the Japanese airfield at Baleo. A force of 50 Zeros rose to intercept them. In the air war of the previous year, such odds would have been suicidal. But Boyington had relentlessly trained his pilots in the science of energy management, in the absolute necessity of maintaining speed and altitude advantage at all costs. The ensuing battle developed in all three dimensions, with Corsairs and Zeros climbing, diving, and turning in a deadly, swirling aerial ballet. But it was a ballet where one partner, the Corsair, held all the decisive advantages. The Black Sheep destroyed 20 Japanese fighters that day, without a single loss to themselves. Boyington himself personally accounted for 5 of those kills, becoming an ace in a day. The technical reasons for the Corsair's now undisputed dominance were multifaceted. The sheer power of its R-2800 engine allowed it to maintain its energy in vertical maneuvers that would cause a Zero to stall and fall out of the sky. The Corsair's robust construction, its heavy armor plating around the cockpit, its self-sealing fuel tanks, and its redundant control systems meant that it could absorb an incredible amount of battle damage and still bring its pilot home. The Corsair's armament was simply devastating. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns, converging at 300 yards, could put over 80 rounds per second on a target. The Japanese pilots reported that being hit by Corsair fire was like being struck by a series of sledgehammers. Their aircraft didn't just go down. They disintegrated in midair. But technology and tactics alone did not win the air war. American industrial capacity produced not just superior aircraft, but a seemingly endless supply of well-trained pilots. While Japan struggled to train replacements for their ever-mounting losses, America's massive training programs were graduating hundreds of qualified pilots every single month. The U.S. Navy's training command had expanded from just 2 main bases before the war to dozens of sprawling facilities across the country. Each new American pilot arrived in the combat theater with at least 300 hours of high-quality flight time, including a minimum of 50 hours in the Corsair itself. Their Japanese counterparts, in stark contrast, often arrived with less than 100 total hours, and sometimes as few as 60. The Corsair's significant margin of superiority meant that even an average American pilot could now consistently defeat a veteran Japanese ace. The aircraft was forgiving of mistakes that would have been instantly fatal in a Wildcat or AP-40. Its incredible speed allowed a young, inexperienced pilot to disengage from an unfavorable situation, and its heavy armor often kept him alive when he made a critical error in judgment. The strategic isolation of the Japanese fortress of Rabaul marked the Corsair's ultimate strategic triumph in the Solomons. By November of 1943, the once mighty bastion was under daily, relentless attack by Corsair-escorted bombers. Its 5 airfields were cratered, unusable ruins. Simpson Harbor was a graveyard of sunken and rusting ships. The 100,000 Japanese troops stationed there were completely cut off, left to wither on the vine as the main thrust of the war passed them by. This incredible victory had been achieved not through a costly and bloody amphibious invasion, but almost entirely through the application of air power, with the F4U Corsair as its principal and most lethal instrument. By January of 1944, the American Corsairs owned the sky over the Solomon Islands. Japanese daylight operations ceased entirely. The few remaining experienced Japanese pilots were withdrawn to defend the inner perimeter of the empire. In their place stood boys who could barely fly, much less fight. They died in droves, sometimes entire formations being wiped out without achieving a single victory. Lieutenant Setamu Komachi, one of the few surviving Japanese aces from the early war, wrote with a chilling finality in his diary, "Today, I watched 12 of our fighters engage 8 American Corsairs. Within minutes, 9 of ours were falling in flames. The survivors fled. I did not attempt to help. What could one more Zero do? The war in the air is lost. We are already dead. Our bodies simply haven't realized it yet." The Corsair's incredible legacy would extend far beyond the Solomon Islands. By late 1944, the initial carrier landing problems had been solved through a combination of pilot training and aircraft modifications, and the Corsairs were operating successfully from the decks of American fast carriers. During the final, bloody battle for Okinawa, the Corsairs proved invaluable in defeating the desperate and terrifying kamikaze attacks. Their high speed allowed them to intercept the suicide aircraft long before they could reach the fleet, and their overwhelming firepower ensured that the kamikazes, once hit, were completely destroyed rather than simply damaged and still able to complete their deadly mission. By the end of the war, the statistics told the complete and undeniable story. Corsairs had destroyed a staggering 2,140 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing only 189 of their own to enemy fighters, an almost unbelievable kill ratio of over 11-1. They had also dropped over 15,000 tons of bombs, accounting for 70% of all the bombs delivered by U.S. Navy and Marine Corps fighters during the entire Pacific War. The aircraft that the Navy had initially rejected as being too difficult to land on a carrier had become, by every conceivable measure, the most successful and dominant naval fighter aircraft in history. Its final, and perhaps most eloquent, testament came from an unexpected source. In his post-war memoirs, Emperor Hirohito himself identified three primary factors that, in his view, had made Japan's defeat inevitable: America's overwhelming industrial capacity, the atomic bomb, and the VOD F4U Corsair fighter. Bullshit. https://synonym.org/si